And this is why the basic science, again, is important. If you want to get those anti-inflammatory effects, which are probably more important for decreasing muscle soreness and fatigue, for decreasing traumatic brain injury markers, for improving muscle mass during times of caloric restriction or improving strength. If you're really looking for those training benefits, as well as some cardiovascular disease protection, I would go for. What up, team? Today we are talking about one of the most talked about supplements in the medical industry, fish oil, or more scientifically speaking, omega-3 fatty acids. This is a $23 billion industry, and it's not surprising due to the many purported effects of omega-3 fatty acid supplementation. We're talking cardiovascular disease health, we're talking dementia inhibition, we're talking training benefits, increased muscle mass, increased strength, decreased diabetes risk, and the list goes on and on. So you can imagine there's hundreds of thousands of studies on omega-3 fatty acid supplementation. However, there's one thing that really made me want to do this video, and that's the fact that the supplementation of omega-3 fatty acids is insanely variable. There was one study specifically that really shocked me, and it looked at 1,000 people, or about 1,000 people, that took omega-3 supplementation, and it looked at all the supplements they took. Out of 1,000 people, there were almost 500 different supplements and over 200 different brands. And then not even that, but there was also a huge range of doses. We're talking 50 milligrams to 3,500 milligrams of EPA and DHA within these supplements. So what that tells me is that the omega-3 supplement industry is really the wild, wild west of supplements. No one has any idea how much milligrams of EPA or DHA they should be taking. No one has any idea what ratio of EPA to DHA they should take, and no one has any idea what benefits they're deriving from taking said ratio of EPA or DHA. So we really need to look into the data here, and that is exactly why I wanted to do this video. So to start us off, what we're going to do, as always, is talk about the basic science of omega-3 supplementation. So to do so, we have to talk about different types of fats. There's three main types of fats we're going to talk about today: saturated fats, polyunsaturated fats, and monounsaturated fats. So saturated fats, not omega-3s, definitely not omega-3s. Saturated fats are ones that are completely saturated with hydrogen molecules. And when they're saturated with hydrogen molecules, there's no double bonds. These fats can line up very right next to each other. And that's why they become solid at room temperature, or tend to be solid at room temperatures, because they're lined up back to back, because there's no double bonds creating any kinks in the structure. These saturated fats, as you probably all know, are not good. They create more atherosclerosis or more risk of cardiovascular disease by clogging up your blood vessels and increase cholesterol. So saturated fats, not what we're talking about today. There's also two other types of fats: monounsaturated. Mono meaning one, unsaturated meaning there's one double bond in there that decreases the amount of hydrogen atoms there, and that one double bond creates a kink in the structure. That kink in the structure, then, when it's lining up next to each other, creates more fluidity. That's why these fats are liquid at room temperature. One you might know of is olive oil. Specifically, olive oil is an omega-9 fatty acid. So again, not what we're talking about today, but plenty of health benefits, and we'll cover that in another video probably. And finally, polyunsaturated fats. And here is where omega-3s lie. But not only omega-3s, also omega-6s. And poly, multiple, unsaturated, multiple double bonds, multiple kinks. Really, the height of membrane fluidity is going to come from omega-3 and omega-6 fatty acids being incorporated into your membranes. And that is where we start our discussion on the function of omega-3s and omega-6s for that matter. So both of these polyunsaturated fats, omega-6 and omega-3s, they get incorporated into cell membranes, and that's where they serve their functions. They do a lot of things there. One, they signal from the extracellular environment into the intracellular environment. They also help modulate transmembrane receptors, meaning they help those transmembrane receptors, ones that latch onto something from outside of the cell and send a signal within the cell. They help increase those transmembrane receptors' ability to send signals through the cell. And they also help send molecules from the outside into the inside. Part of this is due to the increased membrane fluidity. And increased membrane fluidity, another function of omega-3 and omega-6 polyunsaturated fatty acids, is that increased membrane fluidity allows them to get through small vessels, it allows them to better transport oxygen, and really allows them to do their job just in a much more efficient way. So that's some of the functions of omega-3 and omega-6 polyunsaturated fatty acids. But further functions and their really specific signals that they send and the specific ways they help the cell are actually dependent on, is it an omega-6 or is it an omega-3? Which is super interesting based on the fact that that omega-6 and omega-3 difference is just the difference of a few carbons away from each other having that double bond. So what is the difference though? Well, in general, omega-6 fatty acids are seen to be more pro-inflammatory. So what do we mean by that? Well, omega-6 fatty acids, when they are liberated from the cell membrane, when they have a signal, some stimuli external from the cell, they can be liberated and then broken down into pro-inflammatory markers. One specific omega-6 fatty acid of particular interest is arachidonic acid, which comes from linoleic acid. Arachidonic acid then gets broken down and creates prostaglandins, leukotrienes. These molecules are extremely important for vasoconstriction or narrowing those blood vessels, also for increasing inflammation and increasing inflammatory cells, inflammatory molecules to that site to clean up debris, kill something, etc. So you can imagine, if you have a ton of omega-6 in a cell membrane, what you're going to see is increased inflammation, increased vasoconstriction. All of these things are going to cause, one, more atherosclerosis. If it runs rampant more than you want it to, we have increased atherosclerosis, increased cardiovascular disease, increased total body inflammation, increased blood pressure, etc. And what's so interesting about this is a medication that almost everyone probably knows about, Advil or ibuprofen, actually acts on this mechanism. Ibuprofen, a non-steroidal anti-inflammatory drug, an NSAID, actually acts to decrease prostaglandins, which, like we just said, is a derivative of arachidonic acid or omega-6. So we can imagine that increasing our omega-6 concentration within cells to an amount that is much higher than what we want it to be is going to increase our total body inflammation. And there's actually been a lot of good studies on this. One specific study is a 2021 study that demonstrated that a standard American diet is a 20-to-1 ratio of omega-6 to omega-3, which maybe doesn't mean anything to you unless we compare it to 100 years ago. The average was a 4-to-1 ratio of omega-6 to omega-3. And what we've also found is that an increasing omega-6 to omega-3 ratio actually causes increased risk of cancer, increased risk of cardiovascular disease, and increased risk of all-cause mortality or increased risk of dying by having that increased ratio. So one can imagine that if you increase your omega-3s, you're going to decrease that ratio, decrease your inflammation, and have a bunch of positive effects from that. That being said, I want to give a caveat here. And this is a classic human fallacy, is to just say that, oh, omega-6 is bad now. We can't have any omega-6. That's definitely not true. Omega-6 is 100% still very needed for proper development. And specifically, though, we need to look at the proper omega-6 sources. The reason that the standard American diet is so high in omega-6 compared to omega-3s is those vegetable oils, the peanut butter, the cookies, the fried things. And obviously, the standard American diet is very high in those. So I would take those out, add in omega-3 sources, like we'll talk about later, but still get those good omega-6 sources. Nuts, for instance, have a great level of omega-6. Eggs, hemp seed, pumpkin seeds, etc. have great omega-6s that you really need, because we can't have our blood vessels have no arachidonic acid. We still need the ability to constrict our blood vessels when we need. We still need the ability to have some inflammation when we need to clean something up within our cells. Again, it's a problem when we lose our homeostasis. It's a problem when things get out of balance. And a 20-to-1 ratio is certainly out of balance, and that's what we need to fix. So off the bat, even within this basic science section, we're seeing some benefits of omega-3s. Knocking out the excess omega-6s within the cell membrane is going to decrease our inflammation, and that's one of the first and largest benefits of omega-3s. However, what are the other mechanistic benefits of taking omega-3 supplementation or just increasing our levels of omega-3? Well, that really comes down to two main direct mechanisms. And these direct mechanisms then lead to many downstream effects, which are going to be very beneficial for your health and performance and really optimizing you in those areas. So what are these two direct effects? Well, one is actually an FDA-approved direct effect. It's a direct effect that allowed for omega-3s to be a prescription medication for hypertriglyceridemia. So high triglycerides or fats in the blood, omega-3s as a prescription drug has been used to lower these triglycerides, lower these fat within your blood. How does it do that? Well, it does that by multiple mechanisms. One, it decreases the sterile regulatory element binding proteins, which then, through a cascade of events, decreases cholesterol synthesis. Two, it increases beta oxidation, or it increases the burning of fat for fuel. It does this by one, going back to more of our basic science, incorporating in the cell membrane, and then allowing for fats by being incorporated in the cell membrane. It allows for fatty acids to travel in through the cell to be used for energy. It also, in regards to increasing beta oxidation, it also activates PPAR receptors. These PPAR receptors are very important for increasing beta oxidation and just overall metabolism of the cell. So far we have one, decreased cholesterol synthesis, two, increased beta oxidation or increased burning of fat, and three, it also breaks down cholesterol. It activates lipoprotein lipase, which sits on the vessel endothelium or the lining of your blood vessels, and which that lipoprotein lipase, when activated, is able to break down cholesterol. So by increasing lipoprotein lipase, we are increasing cholesterol breakdown. We are also, through omega-3 fatty acid supplementation, we're also going to decrease cholesterol synthesis. And then finally, we're going to increase fat burning. So all these things are going to lower your triglycerides, also just improve your lipid panel in general. And then as you can imagine, by doing so, you're probably going to increase your cardiovascular disease health. So that's the first direct mechanism, is decreasing triglycerides. The second mechanism is going to be an anti-inflammatory mechanism. So you're already asking me, how do we have two direct mechanisms that give us all of these effects? We talked about diabetes, we talked about better training effects, we talked about dementia, we talked about depression, etc. How are all these effects coming from these two direct mechanisms? Well, that really comes from the fact that inflammation is a high driver for a lot of chronic disease states, a high driver for a lot of poor optimization states. So, such as depression, anxiety, dementia, cardiovascular disease, diabetes. All of these things are not maybe driven by, but at least highly contributed by a high level of inflammation. So how do omega-3 fatty acids decrease inflammation? Well, the first way we've already talked about. We lower our omega-6 to omega-3 ratio, we decrease our total body inflammation. Other ways that it does so, though. One, it inhibits your white blood cells when it is incorporated in white blood cell membranes. It inhibits them from releasing a bunch of pro-inflammatory markers. It also, when incorporated in those white blood cell membranes, and also while incorporated on your vessel lining, it inhibits those white blood cells from going in through your vessels and creating inflammatory pools there. It also helps inhibit intracellular inflammatory signaling by decreasing something known as NF-kappa B. And finally, when omega-3 fatty acids are degraded into their own byproducts, they also create anti-inflammatory molecules which actually clean up cellular debris. So a lot of ways that omega-3s do this, and the mechanism is not still fully understood, but these are some ways that it decreases inflammation. And all of this is going to be super important when we actually talk about what are possible benefits of omega-3s and we actually talk about the clinical evidence. So thanks for staying with me there on this one. So two main benefits: lower triglycerides, lower inflammation, and you're going to get supposedly a lot of clinical benefit from this. But how do we know that we're getting enough omega-3s to actually get this difference? Or are we even getting this difference? To start to answer that question, we need to look at omega-3 index. Omega-3 index is truthfully not very talked about within the medical community. I never heard about it in medical school, for instance. But it's a very important marker of cardiovascular disease risk that is just not talked about near enough. So what is the omega-3 index? Well, the omega-3 index is your ratio of DHA plus EPA to the two most important omega-3s. It's your ratio of DHA and EPA to the rest of the fatty acids that make up your cell membrane. Now, what this level is highly correlated in many studies to your cardiovascular disease risk. In specific, one study in 2008 and many studies since then has shown that a omega-3 index of less than 4% is a high risk for cardiovascular disease versus an omega-3 index of greater than 8% is a low risk for cardiovascular disease. And to put even more numbers to this, if you have a greater than 8% omega-3 index compared to a less than 4% omega-3 index, you have a 35% less chance of cardiovascular disease. You have a 35% less chance of cardiovascular disease if you have an omega-3 index which is greater than 8% compared to if you had one of less than 4%. But to back up, why are we even talking about omega-3 index? Why can't we just measure omega-3s within the plasma? Or just like take a blood sample and how many omega-3s are in there? That's good enough. Well, omega-3s, like we said, and this goes back to why it's so important to listen to the basic science part of these videos. The omega-3s are actually having their benefit when they're in the cell membrane. Omega-3 index, like we said, is a measure within the cell membrane. It's not measuring it just within your plasma or your like circulating blood. If you just measure it within your circulating blood, your omega-3s are so variable. If you give someone an omega-3 supplementation, within 5 to 9 hours, their levels of the plasma are going to increase. However, that's not really where the main mechanisms of omega-3s are occurring. The main mechanisms are when they're actually fully incorporated into those cell membranes. And to be fully incorporated into those cell membranes, it takes 55 days for DHA and 136 days for EPA. So you can imagine you need to supplement with omega-3s or just take in a lot of omega-3 through food sources for a long time consistently in order to raise your omega-3 index or raise the concentration of omega-3s within the cell in order to actually get those effects like we talked about. Plasma concentration is not cutting it. And many people have already talked about this, but it's really analogous to just measuring your blood glucose. If you measured your blood glucose after you ate a large piece of cake, sure, it'll be 140 or 160. Does that mean you have diabetes? Hard to say. It's not a great measure. It's one point in time and you just ate a piece of cake. What's going to be more beneficial is to measure your hemoglobin A1C, which is similarly to omega-3 index, a measure of how glucose affects your red blood cells. And that is a 3-month average, essentially, of how much blood glucose you've had in your blood for the past 3 months. Similarly to omega-3s, which is basically an average of how much your omega-3s have been incorporated into your red blood cell membranes over a 3-month span, because red blood cells have a lifespan of about 3 months. So, back to omega-3 index measures. We talked about it. 8%, a much lower chance of cardiovascular disease risk in this 2008 study. But it didn't stop there. People kept researching this. In a Nature study, and obviously Nature is one of the most reputable journals, in 2021, after adjusting for confounding variables, omega-3 index in the top 20% of the population versus the lower 20% of the population. The top 20% had a 15 to 18% lower risk of death, a 15-18% lower risk of all-cause mortality with a high omega-3 index. And finally, just to put it into more context, the Framingham study in 2021 demonstrated that having a low omega-3 index while not smoking was equivalent in all-cause mortality to when you had a high omega-3 index and you smoked. While this isn't exactly to say this, it's basically almost trying to say that smoking and omega-3 index are equivalent markers of cardiovascular disease risk. So, I can't overstate enough how well studied it is that cardiovascular disease risk is very intricately linked and correlated to having a low omega-3 index. And I think even to further put this into context, less of a randomized controlled trial study, but more of just an epidemiological study. If you look at Japan, who has a 5-year longer life expectancy than America, Japan's omega-3 index average throughout their population, closer to 9%. America's closer to 4.3%. So obviously there's a lot of things that could be contributing as to why Japan has a higher life expectancy than America, and I'm sure there is a lot more. But I do find it interesting that the average omega-3 index is much higher in a country with a higher life expectancy, and I think that's, at the very least, it's definitely contributory. So omega-3 index and omega-3 fatty acids are obviously very important to have high if you want to optimize your chance of living longer, increase your lifespan, and decrease your cardiovascular disease risk. I think that's very well proven. However, what are the other benefits? Are there any other benefits? And how do we get our omega-3 index above 8%? That's what we're going to talk about now. Let's start getting more practical. Let's talk about some more benefits of these, and let's dive into more clinical studies regarding omega-3 fatty acids. So why, if I'm telling you that there's so much cardiovascular disease risk protection and there's all-cause mortality protection, why is there so much debate on omega-3s? Well, I think part of that is how the studies have been done. The purest study, and I think you guys could guess this as well, based on just the data that I just presented. The purest study is going to be taking people with omega-3 indexes. You would measure their omega-3 index, and it would be around 4%. You would take all the people that have a low omega-3 index, around 4%. You would supplement them with a certain amount of omega-3s, and then 12 weeks later, so a study with long enough time to actually incorporate omega-3s into your cell membranes. 12 weeks later, you would check their omega-3 index again. You would see, did it come up? It likely would. It would come up to close to 8%, maybe where we want it for a lower cardiovascular disease risk. And then you would measure clinical outcomes at that time. You would see, did they have a training benefit? Did they have lower depression? Did their cognition improve? And you would say, well, we increased omega-3 index from 4 to 8%. And with that 4 to 8% increase, we're also seeing decreases in depression. We're seeing decreases in cardiovascular disease risk, etc. However, most of the trials are not done that way. Most of the trials are, let's take this random group of people, let's give them a random dose of omega-3s, let's give them a random ratio of EPA to DHA, let's never mention why we gave that ratio or why that dose. And then after we gave all of that stuff, and 4 weeks later, when there's not maybe enough time to actually fully see the benefits of the supplementation, let's measure some clinical endpoints. That's kind of where we're left with the studies right now. So while there's some studies and it's catching up, the research is truly catching up, we don't have all the data we need to make for sure decisions on what we think about the supplementation for certain endpoints. I definitely think that there's enough data to prove that a higher omega-3 index and proper omega-3 supplementation to get to that index is going to decrease your cardiovascular disease risk, is going to decrease your all-cause mortality. But for many other clinical endpoints and many other indications, it's still not proven. It's because the studies truthfully just have not been done properly. But let's look at what we do have and let's make some inferences based on that and kind of go from there on what dosing and what ratio you should use. And specifically, I do want you to pay attention to that when we start going through these studies, and we'll talk about it at the end. I want you to pay attention to what dose was used in these studies that we're about to go through. What ratio of EPA and DHA was used in the studies that we're about to go through. Pay attention to that. We'll come back to it after the end and talk about what dose and what ratio you should be using. And we'll talk about even more practical information at the end. To start with our indications here, let's first talk about some positive athletic training performance indications. And I know that's important for a lot of people to watch this video. So one of the first and most studied indications for omega-3s in regards to athletic performance and training is recovery from injury. Specifically, recovery from concussions or mild traumatic brain injuries. Specifically, one study in 2022 looked at a group of athletes who had concussions or mild traumatic brain injuries. They gave them 2 grams of DHA per day, and there was a placebo group as well. The group that got the 2 grams of DHA improved their return to play by 5.5 days and also decreased their symptoms 5 days faster. More studies on the same topic in 2023, giving NCAA football players 2 grams of DHA and 560 milligrams of EPA attenuated their neurofilament light production over that time frame. Neurofilament light is essentially a marker of traumatic brain injury, and it was decreased through omega-3 fatty acid supplementation in this study. And finally, and this one I bring up just because I think it's a great indicator of what we were talking about earlier in regards to how these studies should be done. This 2022 study, who gave football players 2.4 grams of DHA and 1.1 grams of EPA after a concussion, it did not find NFL attenuation in these football players. However, what they did note when you go read the study is that many of these football players did not have good compliance with the omega-3 supplements. But they actually were smart enough to measure their omega-3 index. And what they found was the ones who actually increased their omega-3 index and properly took their omega-3 supplements actually did have NFL attenuation or had attenuation of their traumatic brain injury effects. So I think the data is pretty strong actually for concussions, that if you take supplementation of omega-3s within that time frame, surrounding having a mild traumatic brain injury, you're going to improve your symptoms. You're going to return to play faster. And something else I want you to notice here. What was the ratio of DHA to EPA in these studies? Very high. In one study, it was just DHA. And the reason for this, kind of going back to our basic science studies, is DHA is much more heavily incorporated into neuronal cell membranes or brain cell membranes than is EPA. Actually, 40% of fatty acids within neuronal cell membranes are DHA compared to only 1% for EPA. So right off the bat, here we go, in regards to what ratio you should take. If you're taking it for concussion or you're taking it for cognitive brain effects, you should really look for a supplement that has more DHA compared to EPA. Now, back to looking at more studies for improved injury recovery. Let's talk about improving your muscle mass retention in a period of injury recovery. So say you injure your arm and you can't work it out for 8 weeks. You can imagine that you're probably going to lose some muscle by not being able to move that arm for 8 weeks. Well, what some people theorize is that if you took omega-3 supplementation, due to probably some decreased inflammatory effects like we talked about earlier, you're going to inhibit that muscle mass loss. And truthfully, that's actually what's been consistently found in studies. There was one study that demonstrated giving 2.97 grams of EPA and 2.03 grams of DHA per day caused 8% muscle loss after an injury, such as described, compared to 14% with placebo. So 8 versus 14%, not an insane difference, but a statistically significant and clinically significant difference. And furthermore, as they tracked these athletes after the recovery, they showed that the athletes who had taken and continue to take omega-3 supplementation actually returned to their baseline muscle levels, whereas the placebo group did not. So I think that's another indication in which the studies are pretty clear. Another indication in regards to training adaptations is post-exercise recovery. You get sore, you get fatigued after a workout. Is that going to be improved by the anti-inflammatory mechanistic effects that we talked about from omega-3s? And this is a really interesting one because, one, yes, it is. I would say this is actually one of the most studied indications for omega-3s in regards to athletic performance. So yes, you are going to decrease your muscle soreness and your muscle fatigue by taking omega-3 supplementation. But the really interesting thing is it's actually not dose dependent. They did studies ranging from 0.54 to 4 grams of DHA to EPA and durations of 7 to 70 days. Regardless of the duration, regardless of the dose, you decreased your fatigue and your muscle soreness post-exercise. And then finally, let's talk about training adaptation. So are you going to get stronger? Are you going to gain more muscle from taking omega-3 supplementation when you work out? Well, this one is a little bit more interesting and a little bit more not concrete. Let's look at some studies. So there was a study that gave 2.275 grams of EPA and 1.5 grams of DHA with a 10-week resistance training program. They did not show any lean body mass increase, so no muscle mass increase. They showed a non-significant decrease in fat mass. What they did show, though, was an increase in relative 1 rep max bench and also 1 rep max squat from 17 versus 9% and 29 versus 17%. So around a 10% increase in your bench or squat in this study when taking omega-3s. Another study gave 2 grams of EPA and 2 grams of DHA. And they also calorie restricted these athletes 40%. So they cut out 50% of their caloric intake almost. And then they measured their strength over time. What they found was that when they gave omega-3s, the strength of these athletes actually increased over time. Despite having their diet cut in half, they were still able to increase their 1 rep max leg extension, which is a common method used for measuring strength. They increased their 1 rep max leg extension with omega-3 supplementation despite having this diet cut in half, which is truthfully pretty remarkable. Finally, a couple more studies to round out training adaptation. A 2021 meta-analysis on lean body mass effect showed that there was no actual effect, and they looked at 11 studies. And then finally, a 2023 systematic review, also on lean body mass, basically the same takeaway. There was no homogeneous studies that allowed for us to say, yes, we definitely can increase muscle mass by omega-3 fatty acid supplementation. And again, not too surprising. It's not to say that it doesn't increase your lean body mass, but we just don't have good enough studies yet. We don't have, did we increase omega-3 index, which led to increased muscle mass? Truthfully, we just don't know. I would say that the data it trends positive, but it's definitely not there yet to say that's an indication. But overall, I would say that the best use case for omega-3 in regards to training adaptation is if you are trying to cut, you're trying to lose some fat mass, but you want to keep your strength. I think there's actually decent data to show that omega-3 fatty acids will be able to do that. So moving forward, let's talk about another thing that a lot of viewers of this channel might be interested in, and that is weight/fat loss. Does omega-3 fatty acids help there? Well, overall, I'm going to say it's probably going to be similar to gaining muscle mass. We just don't have homogeneous studies. We don't have that omega-3 index related to clinical endpoints. But let's look at some data to show what I'm talking about. A systematic review in 2021 basically said that exact same thing. They need more RCTs, or randomized controlled trials, to actually determine if it has any effect on fat mass. That being said, there's been some more RCTs since then that have trended positive. In 2022, they gave 1 gram of DHA and EPA total and did show decreased abdominal fat loss within omega-3 supplemented groups. So maybe the data trends positive, but still not rock hard science in regards to we're giving omega-3s for this indication. It's not like the cardiovascular disease risk or in the all-cause mortality that we talked about earlier. And finally, in regards to clinical indications, let's talk about the brain. Let's talk about neurology, let's talk about psychology, and let's talk about how omega-3 fatty acids fit in there. First, let's talk about anxiety and depression and look at a couple meta-analyses that talked about that. So in 2024, there was a meta-analysis and systematic review on omega-3's effects on anxiety. They did find a positive dose response for anxiety. So the more omega-3s you got, the less anxiety that you had, and that was up to, and that the most efficient at, 2 grams of EPA plus DHA per day. That being said, they said that the evidence was not super solid because, again, we need more homogeneous studies. We need that omega-3 index. We need the same dose given, etc. So positive trending effects for anxiety, especially at 2 grams per day. Now let's look at depression. A 2023 meta-analysis on omega-3 effects on depression, truthfully, basically a similar effect. Basically what they showed was that there was positive effects on depression, dose-related, up to 1 grams to 2 grams of EPA to DHA. But interestingly here, you needed to have an EPA to DHA ratio of greater than 60%. So now you might be asking me, Quinn, I thought you said anything with the brain means higher DHA. Well, here's where depression and anxiety are very interesting. Depression and anxiety are very linked to inflammatory processes in the brain, and as well as inflammatory processes in the gut. With the gut-mind axis, inflammatory guts lead to, or can lead to, depression and anxiety as symptoms. So it really does actually kind of make sense that depression and anxiety are decreased by a higher EPA ratio due to that anti-inflammatory effect. Moving on with our neurology and psychology indications, let's start talking about another one where there's actually great evidence. I'll just let the cat out of the bag. Cognition and dementia inhibition. First, let's just look at overall cognition in the healthy or cognitively well. In the 2022 systematic review, they looked at 9 studies, a total of about 1,300 participants, and they looked at omega-3 impact on overall cognitive health. And what they found was positive trends and improved learning, memory, cognition, and overall senses of well-being, as well as blood flow within the brains of omega-3 supplemented participants. Although, again, in order to have some rock-solid evidence, we have to have that omega-3 index. We have to have actual set dosing protocols. But again, trending positive. Now let's look at starving off dementia. In a 2018 systematic review of 7 studies, they looked at omega-3 impact on Alzheimer's disease specifically. Now, basically what they found was that if the Alzheimer's disease is already progressed, omega-3s are not really going to help there. However, if they had very mild AD or Alzheimer's dementia, they can actually help prevent progression to further more advanced forms of Alzheimer's. So it could be a great form of Alzheimer's disease, kind of like slowing if you get it early enough. And finally, to even further drive that point home, in 2023, there was a meta-analysis regarding just dementia and cognitive decline in general, so not just Alzheimer's dementia. They looked at 48 studies, and over 100,000 subjects were in these studies total. What they found was that you could lower your risk for dementia by 20% and especially with DHA. As we talked about, that kind of makes sense. Brain, DHA. They also found a dose response for cognitive decline prevention. They said that it needs to be over a gram total, but if you have DHA specifically, for every 0.1 grams per day, you have an 8 to 10% decrease in cognitive decline risk. And here's some curves to show that. But all this to say is this study was really great study in regards to demonstrating omega-3 fatty acids' ability to decrease cognitive decline and decrease your risk for dementia, especially if you get that high DHA to EPA ratio. And many studies have also corroborated this evidence. So I think that this is actually a great indication for omega-3s. So let's just broad sweeping, let's talk about those clinical effects we just talked about. 1, cardiovascular disease risk. From moving from 4 to 8% on your omega-3 index, you are going to lower your cardiovascular disease risk up to 35%. You're going to decrease your all-cause mortality up to 18%. That's remarkable. So yes, omega-3 index and omega-3 fatty acids have a great benefit on cardiovascular disease and all-cause mortality. 2, let's talk about training. Great injury recovery supplement, especially for concussions, but especially also for muscle mass maintenance and muscle mass strength improvement in both injury recovery as well as when you're in a caloric restricted environment. And then finally, on the neurology side, possible positive trends towards anxiety and depression benefit, positive trends in just overall cognition, and definite positive trend and really good evidence for decreasing dementia and decreasing cognitive decline. So overall, what you can kind of see is there's a lot of positive trends on these things, and I think we just need more studies, more homogeneous studies with the exact dose and the exact omega-3 index measured to really give us what the exact benefit is. But I think, as you can see, there's a lot of proven benefit and some that could be proven with more studies. If I missed any other indication you want me to talk about, drop it in the comments below, and I'll try to talk about it. I'll try to look into some more studies, and we'll talk about other omega-3 indications in the comments. And also, if you're really enjoying this video and it's helping you out, give me a like, give me a subscribe. It really goes a long way. Now we know about all of these benefits of omega-3 supplementations and just getting your omega-3 index higher, especially compared to that omega-6 that we talked about as well. How are we going to get that omega-3 higher? What are the sources of omega-3? So first off, let's just talk about food sources. The highest food source that you're going to get omega-3s from is fish. And specifically, some fish that have high omega-3 values are mackerel. It's up to 4.5 grams of EPA and DHA per serving. Salmon is up to 2.15 grams per serving. Herring up to 2.15. Sardines up to 1 gram. Oysters up to 329 milligrams per serving. So basically, fish is going to be our greatest source of food getting that omega-3 index higher. However, one omega-3 that we haven't talked about as much is ALA, or alpha-linolenic acid. Alpha-linolenic acid is actually not found in fish, it's found in seeds. So what a lot of vegetarians or vegans do when they want to get their omega-3 higher is they take ALA. Is that okay? Well, it is going to maybe increase your omega-3 fatty acids just in general. But when we talked about omega-3 index, we talked about how it's a measure of EPA plus DHA divided by the total fatty acid content of the cell. It does not take into account ALA. Really, this is partly because ALA is not near as studied to have these mechanistic effects that EPA and DHA has. So far, we've basically been talking about the effects of EPA and DHA. So the good news is, though, ALA can be converted into DHA and EPA. So vegetarians, vegans, what they're kind of doing when they eat these foods, and obviously non-vegetarian and vegan also can eat these foods, but you're taking in these foods, you hope that it converts to EPA and DHA, and there you go, incorporate it into the cell membrane, get the effects we talked about. So that conversion, though, of ALA to EPA and DHA is very variable depending on the person. One, it's variable depending on your age. So if the older you get, the less conversion of ALA to the more effective, we'll say, EPA and DHA. Also, if you're a woman, you actually get higher ALA to EPA and DHA conversion. This is likely due to estrogen's effect on this conversion. Also, there's just genetic polymorphisms, or just basically people's genetics are going to affect ALA to EPA and DHA conversion. And finally, having high omega-6 actually decreases your ALA to EPA and DHA conversion. The reason for this is because omega-6, linoleic acid, one of the chief omega-6 ones that actually goes down to create arachidonic acid, linoleic acid competes with ALA or alpha linoleic acid for the same enzyme when they are converted. So ALA creates EPA and DHA, linoleic acid creates arachidonic acid. They compete for the same thing. So if you have a lot of omega-6, you're not going to convert your ALA to EPA and DHA because it's competing for that same enzyme. That being said, all of that talk is truthfully not that useful because a ALA to EPA and DHA is low regardless. That conversion is always going to be low. In fact, only 1 to 10% of ALA is going to be converted to EPA, and 0.5 to 5% is going to be converted to DHA. So very low amounts. So if you take we'll say 5% on average of your ALA being converted to the more effective, more studied EPA and DHA, 5% to get to what a lot of these studies are saying, like 2 grams, 4 grams, we'll just say even 2 grams, you would need 40 grams of ALA. And how do you get 40 grams of ALA? Well, let's talk about some sources of it. So like we said, seeds. So chia seeds up to 5 grams of ALA per serving. Flaxseed up to 2.5. Walnuts are 2.5 per serving. Soybeans are 670 milligrams of ALA per serving. But let's just take, for instance, walnuts or chia seeds. You would need 16 servings of walnuts or 8 servings of chia seeds or 16 servings of flax seeds a day to get 40 grams of ALA, which would be then converted to 2 grams of EPA and DHA. So truthfully, if you want to get close to like what these studies are recommending for grams of EPA and DHA, ALA is not going to be the way to go. Even if you're super young, you're a female, you have great genetics for it, and you have low omega-6s. It doesn't really matter. Your ALA conversion to EPA and DHA is going to be not significant enough. But we haven't really talked about, though, does ALA actually have benefits in and of itself? Does it have to be converted to EPA and DHA? Well, we said that EPA and DHA are much better studied, but what about ALA? Well, there actually was a great study that talked about the differential effects of ALA versus EPA versus DHA. And basically the overall takeaway was kind of what I've said, which is EPA and DHA are better studied, and they definitely have better robust mechanisms for especially cardiovascular disease protection and lipid lowering than do ALA. But ALA, independently of EPA and DHA conversion, does still, according to this study, does still have some anti-inflammatory effects, does still have some cardiovascular disease risk protection. So maybe it's not all about ALA being converted to EPA and DHA and that's its only use case. ALA might be beneficial in and of itself. That being said, we need way more studies on that to say that you can just take ALA and it's going to help in the same way that taking EPA and DHA is. So truthfully, I would still, as of right now, focus on your EPA and DHA levels and supplementing with that instead of ALA. Although chia seeds, flax seeds, great things to take. Not saying that you shouldn't take those either. That's EPA, that's DHA, that's ALA. Those are food sources. We've talked about we need to take EPA and DHA to get all the benefits we've talked about. So unless you are taking fish every day, you're probably going to need a supplement. Because what did we talk about in regards to the dosing when we heard about all of those studies? Well, they were saying 2 grams, 3 grams, 4 grams, 6 grams. Well, you just heard me talk about the fact that salmon has about 2 grams a serving. So unless you're going to have salmon every day for dinner, you're probably going to need an omega-3 supplement to get up to proper levels. So we're going to need to talk about supplements. And this is going to be very important, and this is going to be hopefully one of the biggest practical takeaways of this video, because we just talked about at the onset of this video, supplements are so varied. We talked about 50 milligrams to 4 grams of EPA and DHA within these supplements. So we really have to figure out, when you go look online, you go to the store, which one are you actually going to get benefit from? So that's what I want to talk about now. I want to talk about that practical implication of this video and of all this science that we've just talked about. So first, let's talk about dose. Let's talk about the fact that, we probably do need supplementation. And I think, one study to talk about to really probably prove even more that you need supplementation is this study that looked at omega-3 index, and it found that only 3% of people that had 1 serving of fish per day and only 17% that had greater than 2 servings of fish per day had omega-3 indexes greater than 8%. So only 3% of people that had a fish serving of fish per week, and only 17% that had greater than 2 servings of fish per week had omega-3 indexes that were compatible with lowering their cardiovascular disease risk. And even among those that had greater than 2 servings of fish per week, even among that group, they still had to supplement with 1,100 milligrams per day of EPA and DHA to get their omega-3 index greater than 8%. And then for non-fish eaters, the average was 1,300 milligrams per day of EPA and DHA to get your omega-3 index above 8%. In other words, like I said before, you're pretty much going to have to supplement if you wanted to get your omega-3 index above 8% and get that cardiovascular disease risk protection. So maybe you have to get above 1.3 grams if you don't eat fish, or 1.1 grams if you do eat fish in a supplement per day to get to that omega-3 index level. But how much do we need? Do we actually need more than that? Well, think back on the studies that we talked about. No study really showed any benefit with taking less than a gram per day of EPA plus DHA. The only one that had no dose effect was the muscle soreness and fatigue. So yeah, you're gonna decrease your soreness and decrease your fatigue if you take any dose, truthfully. How much you decrease it probably is somewhat dose dependent, although not really shown yet. But all this to say is you probably are gonna need up greater than a gram a day. But most of these studies were even greater than 2 grams. Depression was between 1 and 2 grams per day. Anxiety was the best at 2 grams. But then a lot of other indications were 2 to 4 grams. At the onset, we talked about how there's an FDA prescription omega-3. That's 4 grams per day. And then let's talk about some rapid fire studies in regards to dosing as well. There's another study that showed 2 to 3 grams per day resulted in blood pressure lowering. There was one that looked at athletes that showed 93% of them were deplete in omega-3s per the omega-3 index, and 3 grams was actually better than 2 grams in repleting them above that 8% mark. And finally, I think the most important to talk about in regards to dosing is this 2021 study, an update on omega-3, polyunsaturated fatty acids, and cardiovascular disease health. It really showed that omega-3 supplementation, and this is obvious based on what we've talked about here, omega-3 index is important. They found that in countries like Japan or populations that have a high omega-3 index at baseline, yeah, sure, 1 gram a day is probably all you need. It'll bring it up just fine to above that 8% or whatever level you need to see clinical benefit. But when you're only going to give a gram a day to someone who has an omega-3 index baseline at 4%, it might get up to 5-6%, but that's not going to do it. They're going to need that 2, 3, 4 grams that we talked about earlier. So all this to say, how much omega-3 should you take based on all the studies we talked about? Well, one thing I'll say is the best way to do this is pay the $50, which is about what it is, to get your omega-3 index tested. Once you get that omega-3 index tested, you can see, okay, maybe you're at 7%. Okay, maybe you just need a gram a day and then you're going to be fine. But maybe you're at 4%. Then you're going to maybe need a couple grams a day. The thing is, it's very dependent on your body and your genetics and your diet are all factors that influence how much omega-3 is actually incorporated into your cell membrane. So just because you and your buddy both have 5% omega-3 indexes, that's not going to matter. It doesn't mean that you both can take 2 grams and you'll both get to the same spot. You both might take 2 grams and you might get to 8% and your buddy might get to 6%. So you really need to monitor it over time, get it tested, work with your doc, get the right supplement, and then kind of test it again a few months later, titrate the supplement, etc. That being said, if you don't want to do that, I would recommend probably starting at around 2 grams per day. We saw all these studies working at about 1 to 2 grams at the very least. I think 2 grams is a really good starting point. If you do that consistently, you'll probably get above an omega-3 index of 8%, and you're still going to get all these benefits that we talked about. But why not higher? Can we just go to 6, 7, 8 grams? What about if our omega-3 index was at 14%? Does that help us? Well, one thing that I like to mention is, again, this is about homeostasis. Bigger is not always better. More reduction is not always better. Reducing your omega-6 and not having any inflammation, like we said, that'd be terrible. You would die. You would not be able to develop correctly if you did not have enough omega-6. So we don't want to drive it into the ground. So my hypothesis, and truthfully, we haven't had this tested in many studies. We haven't tested what an omega-3 index of 12% looks like compared to an 8%. But what I can hypothesize just based on general science and homeostatic mechanisms is you're probably not going to drive your omega-3 index up to 14%. maybe you want it up to 10 to 12%. And I think that there's some logical basis for that, given the fact that a lot of supplementation of 4 grams or even 6 grams in some of these studies did provide more clinical benefit, but we never looked at what their starting omega-3 index was and what it ended up being. So I think that maybe getting it closer to 10% based on these mega doses of omega-3 supplementation that a lot of these studies used might provide some clinical benefit. But that being said, for right now, I think using 2 grams is a safe amount to provide that homeostasis that we're talking about, to get you in that 8 to 10% omega-3 index range and to see the benefits that we talked about. And also to speak on the adverse effects of maybe increasing your omega-3 index too high. What are the adverse effects of too much omega-3s? Well, truthfully, they've done a lot of studies, specifically because this was an FDA-regulated prescription drug at 4 grams for hypertriglyceridemia, like we talked about. They've done a lot of studies on adverse effects of omega-3s, and truthfully, there's not very many, which is great news. Most of the adverse effects are simply GI upset, nausea, maybe some rare vomiting, a weird taste in your mouth. That's mostly the only thing that happens. But an interesting study that was done recently, and then they've kind of went back on the studies and retroactively looked at the data, is they've found a weird link between atrial fibrillation, or this weird heart rhythm, and omega-3 fatty acid supplementation. Atrial fibrillation can eventually lead to heart failure. It can also more acutely lead to strokes, blood clots in your heart, essentially, that get shot off into your brain and cause strokes. So AFib is kind of a dangerous thing, and omega-3 fatty acids are weakly correlated with an increased risk of AFib. But the interesting thing when you look at these studies is it's 100% dose dependent. And what they found was that at less than a gram of supplementation of omega-3 fatty acids per day, you're not going to see any increased AFib risk. Truthfully, you're not really going to see much risk even to 1.8 grams per day. But once you get past that, you're starting to see small risk increases in getting AFib. Specifically, this was seen in something known as the STRENGTH trial, but they showed a small increase from 3.9% risk of AFib to 5.3% risk. So truthfully, a very small but statistically significant increased risk of AFib with omega-3 fatty acid supplementation. So all that being said, am I afraid of taking omega-3s now? No. And I'm truthfully definitely not afraid of taking it at what I recommended, 2 grams per day. The FDA has actually said you should take no more than 2 grams per day of omega-3 supplements, and then no more than 3 grams per day total, but no more than 2 grams being from supplements. So I feel very safe recommending 2 grams per day of omega-3 supplements for your diet in order to get your omega-3 index closer to 8 to 10%. But again, do be aware there's a very, very small increase in AFib with taking higher and higher doses. So maybe that's a reason to not take 4 grams, and which was more correlated with that AFib risk. And that's kind of why I've settled at 2 grams for right now, but I'd like to see more data on what are the benefits of 10, 12, 14% omega-3 indexes compared to the 8% omega-3 index, which is normally studied. That's the dose. We'll say 2 grams per day of EPA plus DHA. But what is that 2 grams made up of? What is the EPA to DHA ratio that is ideal? Well, it depends. Everybody's favorite answer. So if you're going to take omega-3 fatty acids with the primary intention of improving your cognitive health, decreasing your dementia risk, just improving your learning, your memory, etc., look for something that's higher in DHA. We already talked about how this incorporates more into brain cell membranes than does EPA. A couple example products, and I'm not affiliated with any of these people, but Thorne has a great DHA to EPA ratio product, and Orthomolecular also has one that's high DHA. It's about DHA and EPA are about similar, which would be a good choice if you want to lean more towards the cognitive effects. If you're looking for, on the other end of the spectrum, something more anti-inflammatory, and you really want to get the effects, and this is why the basic science, again, is important. If you want to get those anti-inflammatory effects, which are probably more important for decreasing muscle soreness and fatigue, for decreasing traumatic brain injury markers, for improving muscle mass during times of caloric restriction or improving strength. If you're really looking for those training benefits, as well as some cardiovascular disease protection, I would go for a higher EPA than a DHA. There was actually a study which demonstrated that higher EPA to DHA ratios from more like EPA to DHA 2 to 1 demonstrated more of a decrease of inflammatory markers, specifically CRP, compared to lower ratios of EPA to DHA. However, it did show that increasing EPA to DHA ratio could cause increased blood pressure as well. And for that reason, I would say that if you're overall looking for just overall cardiovascular disease protection, overall all-cause mortality protection, I'd probably go with something that's between a 1-to-1 and a 2-to-1 ratio of EPA to DHA. So that's dose, that's ratio. We're nearing the final stretch. You're going to go to the store now. You're going to look online. What are some other intangibles that you should be looking for? Well, what is the source of your omega-3? So there's 3 main sources: fish, krill, and algae. Let's go through all of those individually. So first of all, in general, the larger the source, the higher the amount of toxins that's going to be there. So if you have a huge fish, it's more likely that's ate all these other little things, little fish. It's been around in the ocean and it's probably picked up some mercury, for instance, or other toxins. So the larger the fish, the more likelihood that you're going to have some toxic effect within those omega-3s. And these toxins are very small. It's probably negligible, but it's something to consider. So let's go from smallest to largest. Algae. This is where the fish get their omega-3. And algae is typically more DHA to EPA. So if you're looking for that cognitive effect, algae could be a good source. It's also super sustainable. It's environmentally friendly, which is also great. And it's a great vegetarian and vegan option. So algae is all great. The one problem is it's much more expensive on a DHA and EPA per dollar. So if you look at Nordic, which has a good one, 600 milligrams of EPA plus DHA per serving, and there's 30 servings and that costs $30. So if you do all that math, you're going to get $1.67 per gram of EPA to DHA, which is kind of expensive when we compare to, let's look at some other ones. Well, krill then would be your next largest source. Krill is smaller fish, so they're going to have less toxins. That's great. And that might be the only benefit of krill, though, truthfully. It has much, much, much lower EPA and DHA amounts. So for 60 servings, for one serving, it's 200 milligrams, and that's $30. You do the math there, it's $2.50 per gram of EPA and DHA. So truthfully, I'd probably stray away from krill. And finally, fish. So the least sustainable option, unfortunately, but also the most cost efficient. And also, unfortunately, the most risk for toxins, but again, I think that's probably negligible. But for fish, looking at specifically orthomoleculars, 820 milligram EPA and DHA. For $120, you get 108 servings of that. That's 82 cents per gram of EPA and DHA. So it's definitely the most cost efficient. But truthfully, I'll leave it up to you. You know, it's really going to be, you need to get a certain amount of EPA and DHA, like we talked about, probably around 2 grams in a ratio that you want. So I'll leave it up to you knowing that knowledge. I personally take fish oil right now. I would love for a more sustainable option to come available in the future. But right now, algae oil for cost is kind of tough. And also the ratio of DHA to EPA is also kind of tough there. But it's a great vegetarian vegan option is algae. And it's also a great sustainable option. So I would go algae or I'd go fish oil. I'd probably stray away from krill oil just because of the cost efficacy of it. Next little intangible to talk about is when you look at the label, it's going to say this amount of EPA and DHA and this amount of other fatty acids or other omega-3s. There was one study that talked about this very well, which kind of just discussed a problem with the supplement market in general, which is it's not FDA regulated. And the problem with that is you don't know what you're getting. You could be getting some toxic material. You could be getting saturated fats instead. You could be getting things that actually increase your LDL. So the fact that it's not FDA regulated, I would highly stray away from things that have a high amount of other fatty acids or other omega-3s. And if they do, I would make sure that those companies are third-party tested and very reputable. This is not a place to be super cheap with. Next, intangible, ethyl ester versus triglyceride forms. So there's multiple forms of omega-3 fatty acids. Which one is better? Well, in short, triglyceride form is the better, hands down. It's also going to be a little bit more expensive than the cheap ethyl ester form, but it's worth it, and here's why. One, ethyl esters are going to be not nearly as well as absorbed. Only 20% in some studies is absorbed compared to that triglyceride form. So even if the ethyl ester is half the price, you're only getting 20% of it compared to the triglyceride, so it's not going to be near as beneficial to you. Two, it's more likely to be oxidized, which is going to create more atherosclerosis, more cardiovascular disease risk, and it's cheaper, it has more contaminants. Just stray away from the ethyl ester form if you can. I would stick to that more natural triglyceride form if possible. That being said, if you do have an ethyl ester form, it's going to become even more pertinent that you take your omega-3 fatty acid supplements with a fatty meal. That fatty meal is going to stimulate enzymes that are going to be needed to break down that omega-3 supplement and actually allow your body to use it. And truthfully, it's probably important to take omega-3 fatty acids to some extent with a fatty meal, regardless of the form, but it's much more important with ethyl ester. Next is liquid or capsule. This is a question that I get pretty frequently asked. There's not actually a lot of studies on this. There was one study that demonstrated that the liquid form, and this is a 2009 study, they showed that the liquid form was actually a little bit better absorbed than the capsule form. That being said, the liquid form is going to be more expensive, and most of the studies have been done on capsule form. So I still take a capsule form. You're going to get enough absorption with that. I don't think you really need more absorption with the liquid form, but that is one option. And finally, on these intangibles, let's talk about just some miscellaneous factors. One, when you look at the bottle, I would ideally find you a bottle that is dark, it's shaded from the light, because these fatty acids are actually light sensitive. They could become more oxidized and then one, be detrimental to you, and two, you're just not going to get the most effect if you allow it to contact light all the time by having a translucent bottle. Two, on a similar note, they're also sensitive to the air, humidity, etc. So ideally, you keep it in your fridge, but truthfully, if you just keep it in a dark cabinet and don't allow it to just sit open to air all the time, you're probably fine. On the same token though, also check the expiration date. A lot of these times, these companies can just keep the expired ones on the shelf, or you find it in your apartment now after watching this video and you bought these things a few years ago. I wouldn't take those because they're going to get oxidized. Now they're going to become more detrimental than they are efficacious, and you just don't want that. So check your expiration date before buying or taking these supplements. And finally, as far as the company goes and the brand, don't be cheap on this one. Really get yourself a good company that you know is going to have actual EPA and DHA, not random fatty acids, which could be detrimental to you. You want it to be third-party tested. I mentioned a couple that are good. I don't have affiliation with these, like I said, but Thorne, Orthomolecular, there's a couple other ones too. I mean, there's many other ones that will be just fine, but don't cheap out on this one. Get a good third-party tested supplement that doesn't have a lot of extra omega-3s in it. So that's all the information I got for you guys. Let's wrap this up with my overall supplement grade. I would give this one, omega-3 fatty acids, an A-. Here's why. I think, one, great cardiovascular disease risk data, great all-cause mortality data. I mean, you get from a 4% to an 8% by taking omega-3s popularly, you're going to be golden. And I think that alone gives this an A-. And I think there's also a lot of other good supplement uses there. There's improved muscle soreness, there's improved muscle mass and strength in times of caloric restriction, there's improved dementia risk. There's a lot of things that are already pretty well proven, and then there's a lot of things on the frontier which are going to be hopefully proven when we get more studies on omega-3 index and more homogeneous dosing, etc. If we get all of that, this could be an A+ supplement, but regardless, I would definitely recommend almost everybody being on an omega-3 supplement, but at the very least, get your omega-3 index tested and check for yourself. Thank you guys so much for watching. If you have a supplement that you want me to review next, please drop it in the comments. And again, like, subscribe, please help me out there. And other than that, I will see you all next time.